Alright everyone, here's now the time for us to focus on the verb group or the process. Over the semester we've looked at comprehension and considering learners who are EALD, and you've had some assessments, some online tests that you could have done about understanding verbs or processes. So today we're going to bring all of those things together, and hopefully you're going to do some solid learning about processes and verbs. We're going to focus on what verbs look like in a narrative text, and to do this you're going to need to access the video of the storybook Cat and Fish. I've added this as a link below in the Blackboard site. So let me tell you what I want you to do, and then you'll need to pause this video and open up the Cat and Fish one. What I would like you to do is to create a word bank. So as you listen to the story of Cat and Fish through the YouTube clip, I want you to write down as many of the verbs as you can possibly identify. Okay, you might need to go through and watch and read the Cat and Fish story a few times. See how many words that are verbs that you can write down. Okay, then come back to this presentation. As we talked about in the previous presentation that was looking at your prior knowledge, verbs tell us what's happening in a clause, and when we're looking at their function inside that clause, we tend to call them processes when we're using our knowledge of functional grammar. So all our experiences and the things that we do are made up of either doings, happenings, or states that we're in, and so we refer to them as processes. They typically take the form of a verb, and through that we see four different types of happenings generally. Okay, one of those happenings is what we're doing, and so an action type of verb. One of those doings is a saying type of verb. Sometimes we have actions or happenings that are about thinking, feeling, or perceiving, so about our senses. And then we have a special group of verbs or processes that are about relating or existing, being and having. Okay, so although there were 5 dot points there, those last two are very much linked together when we talk about the types of processes that we come across. So what I'd like you to do now is to think about the verbs that you have written from Cat and Fish, and you're going to do some sorting into those 4 types of verbs. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a table that shows the 4 types of processes or verbs that we talk about with children. Action, thinking and feeling, which are often called sensing verbs, saying verbs, and verbs of being or having. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to take the verbs that you found from Cat and Fish, press pause here and see if you can sort them into what type of verb they are. And here are the answers that I've come away with. You can see that inside of the action verbs we've got things like climbing, finding, there's a one in there that shouldn't be there, should not be there, played, lurked, prowled. These are all action types of verbs. In the thinking and feeling one, we've got deciding, worrying, wondering, hoping, remembering. In saying, screamed, shouted, pleaded, replied, said, whispered, murmured. And then the verbs of being, and that should also have having on it, being and having, are am, are, is, etc. We call those relating verbs because they relate to things together. For example, if I said we are students, I'm relating we to the fact that we are students. Okay, so they are relating verbs or relating processes. I wonder how you went with your sorting. So the reasons that we have to know about this is because we're expected to teach students about different types of verbs. You can see here from at least year 3, and even earlier we're talking about types of verbs, but in year 3 we're identifying types of verbs and the way that they add meaning to a sentence. Okay? In year 3 we're exploring action and saying verbs in narrative text to show how they give information about what characters say and do, and in year 3 again exploring the use of sensing verbs and how they allow readers to know what characters think and feel. I wonder if you've ever read a book, a novel, and felt that you really understood the character well, the main character. You really felt like you understood what they were thinking and feeling. It's likely that the author was cleverly using sensing verbs to allow you as the reader inside the mind of the character. Other stories may have lots of action verbs in it, so you understand and see what the character is doing. So the choices that the author makes adds meaning to a sentence, and in terms of what they want us to feel and see as a reader. It's a very, very important way for authors to get us to have a view about what's happening in the story. So from year 3 onwards, we're discussing not only the types of verbs, not only labeling them, but we're also thinking about what that information does to us as readers. Here are just a few other examples of how this knowledge of verbs grows through the Australian Curriculum English. In the first one there you see another one from year 3, and how the particular verbs that you choose might represent a character in a particular way. Let me give you an example of this. If I asked you to think about the character who was whispering frantically, as opposed to a character who was whispering quietly, we increasingly get an idea about the character from those the particular choices of verbs, or shouted, whispered, wondered, help us to see the character and evaluate them differently. I'm going to give you an example of that in a few slides. In year 6, we're looking at choosing more expressive verbs as a way to make action more vivid. You probably remember at your teacher trying to get you to choose words other than said or walked in order to make what was happening in your story more interesting. So here, that's a very big focus in year 6. Now, to be able to do that, I need to be able to call on different types of verbs and know a lot about verbs in order to make my action more vivid. Let's look at some things that you might do with students if you were teaching these elements. Okay, let's say that you're giving this activity to your students. You have the sentence, he sauntered into the principal's office. And what you ask them to do is to change the verb to make the boy sound more respectful. Sauntering isn't really showing a particularly respectful kind of walk. So what you're asking the students to do there is to change the way that they view the character there. So which indicator do you think it's addressing, that activity? Are you asking them to select a choice of verb that presents different evaluations of characters in texts? Or are you helping them to see that, knowing that verbs often express actions and that the choice of more expressive verbs makes for action more vivid? My opinion would be that it's more about selecting action that represents a character in a particular way. It's more about the first one. Because if I'm not asking just to make the action more vivid, I'm actually asking them to change the character, make a different evaluation of the character by changing it from sauntering to something else. We could say he walked into the principal's office. He edged into the principal's office. And each time we do that, we're getting a different idea about that character and perhaps what his motives are, perhaps what's come before him entering the principal's office. Okay, let's try this one. In this case, you've asked the students to make this sentence more interesting by changing one of the verbs, okay? He said he was scared. Well, of course, there we've got two verbs, haven't we? Said and was scared. In this case, what are you addressing? Are you asking them to select the action verbs that represent a character in a particular way? Or are you asking students to make the text come alive by using more expressive action verbs? Okay, I would say, again, this is, well, not again, this one is more related to that year 6 indicator, isn't it? He said he was scared. He said he was terrified. He said he was, now I've gone blank. You can see how choosing different texts are going to give different ideas as to the actual happening, and to provide the reader with a more vivid kind of image in their mind, because that's what we're trying to do as writers. We're trying to create some really clear and good mental images for our readers, and so using different, more expressive verbs can do that as a way of an author impacting on their reader. So we see different types of verbs in information reports or information text. Here's an example of perhaps the beginning of a young child's information report. The cat is a mammal. Mammals are warm-blooded and have fur. So there are two verbs, there are verbs in these two sentences. I wonder if you can pick them out. If we were working with children, we'd ask them to circle the verbs. Okay, so have a look at the first sentence. The cat is a mammal. Which word would you circle as the verb? Okay, the word is the verb there. And if you remember back to the different types of verbs there are, this is a relating verb. It's a verb of being or having. It's relating those two pieces of information together. That on one side you've got a cat or the cat, and on the other side you've got this idea of a mammal. And so is showing a relationship between them. Okay. Mammals are warm-blooded. Are is a verb there. It's a relating verb. Again, it's relating mammals to the concept of warm-blooded. And have fur. Have is a verb there, a verb of being or having, a verb of having, of course, a relating verb. It's relating mammals to fur again. So these are the types of verbs we have in information reports, because you're not as likely to see sensing or feeling verbs when you're trying to give information about something in a factual way. You're most likely in an information report to see relating verbs. Right, so to give you a big tick for that, yes, the verbs to be and the verb to have are relating verbs, and these verbs relate to pieces of information together, as I said. So they don't represent actions, speaking, thoughts or feelings, but rather they link or relate two pieces of information together, and that's why you'll sometimes see them as linking verbs, although we refer to them as relating verbs here and in the curriculum. They describe or define, and so they are very common in factual texts. Relating verbs are found as early as Year 3 in the Australian Curriculum English. And you can see here this one, Year 3, is asking the students or telling the students that they will be exploring the use of relating verbs in constructing definitions and descriptions. Of course, that's just what we said that their role is to do, so that's why that makes perfect sense. Okay, let's have a look at some longer texts with some relating verbs and have a look at what types of verbs there are. Okay, here's a short text, and what I'm going to get you to do is to follow the 3 points, the dot points at the end there. So we're going to read the text, and you're going to make a list of the verbs and then group them into whether they're being or having verbs. Remember, being or having verbs are both found inside that relating type of process or verb. The verb am belongs to one of the group. Which one? And to use these verbs in your own simple sentences, create grammar rules for their use. For example, when do we use is and when do we use has? Okay, so here's the short text, thinking about which verbs are to be and which are to have. The koala is a mammal. Okay, is that being or having? And is part of a special group called marsupials. Marsupials breathe with lungs, are warm-blooded, and have live babies. They also have fur or hair somewhere on their bodies, and female koalas have a pouch. The koala has no close relatives, and its name means an animal that does not drink, which is from an Aboriginal language. Okay, so can you find the verbs of being and the verbs of having from that text? Let's have a look at the answer. Looking at the being and having verbs in this text, you can see that there are the verbs are and the verbs have. Now the rule is, of course, if that we're talking about being, we're going to talk about I am and you are. So in that case, being is going to be the am and the are kinds of verbs that are used there. When we talk about having, it's I have and you have. So you see that they don't change there in the I or you or we. But if we use words like she, we're going to have to change have to has. So can you see the difference between being and having? Being, verbs being am and are, really about, it's hard to explain, isn't it? But being, they're kind of innate to you. Whereas having, you can almost imagine that there's something additional to you. You have red hair, or you have a new book. Whereas you are a human, you are 31 years old. Those are more innate. Okay, so very slight differences there, but interesting to know the real complexity and the nuances of the different types of verbs we have. Remember, both of these belong under the heading of relating verbs. Well, here they are in a table just to show you the different ways that we use them. If you look at the to be column, we've got I am, you are, it would be he is, she is, it is, we are, they are. Now look at to have. I have, you have, he has, we have, they have. What happens is that these ones don't stay the same. Okay, they're not regular in the way that they act. We have to change them depending on the pronoun or depending on the participant that we are using. That's going to be a challenge for some students, isn't it? Particularly for some students who perhaps have English as an additional language and where their first language has different elements of tense in it, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So I wonder if you've ever thought about how some of these are talking about being and some are talking about having, and how you are changing the verb depending on what kind of pronoun you're adding with it. It's quite complicated, isn't it? The challenges of relating verbs is that they are irregular in the simple present tense. So when we're talking about to be, we can see that we use am, are, and is. When we have using the word have, we have or has. So it really does raise a challenge for teaching, because what you need to do with students when you're constructing definitions is to use the relating verbs like is and are, and yet when you're talking about having, which is going to help you with descriptions, they're going to be using has and have. And all of that depends on the preposition that you're, sorry, not preposition, the pronoun that you're using before. If it is being used, then you have to use the word has. If you're using they, then of course it becomes have. Now this can be quite tricky for students, as you can well imagine. Okay, so a few things that we've talked about in this last section. Relating verbs are part of the teaching that we do in ACARA, particularly for Year 3. They're important for information reports, some other text types as well, but definitely for information reports. In the simple present tense, we conventionally use that in information reports. That's the examples that you had before about a mammal or a frog is an amphibian. They have 4 legs and those sorts of things. And amongst other things that are tricky about relating verbs in particular is that they're irregular in the present simple tense. So depending on who we're speaking about, we'll have to use a different relating verb, from I am to you are, and so on. So quite complicated. So let's now talk about some helping verbs or auxiliary verbs. In the first section of the video earlier, I did mention to you about sometimes these relating verbs acting as auxiliary verbs or helping verbs, and that's when we use them to join with another verb or another word that's acting like a verb in order to help us with tense or to help us with the modality or the how an obligation we have to something or how likely something is to happen. Now you're going to look at modal auxiliaries in one of the activities in the other folders. So this is just a brief look at these. You'll spend some more time on those in that activity. But let's have a look at this. So an auxiliary verb is a verb used in forming the tenses, the mood, and the voices of other verbs. The primary auxiliary verbs in English are be, do, and have, and the modal auxiliaries are can, could, may, might, must, shall, should, will, and would. So as I just said, there are other activities for you to have a look at those there. So if we're being, we're thinking about am, is, are, was, were, being, and been. Doing, do, does, do, did, and have, has, have, been, had, and having. Of course, these ones will often work with another. Let's put them together. We would have, how am I putting them together? May have been late. Ought to have signed. Must have signed. Should have signed. All of these work together to create a complicated verb group, and each of them is doing something different there. So remember, we've got the auxiliaries that are helping. So if I have a sentence that says I am running, I've got am running as the verb group there. Am being the auxiliary or the helping verb, and running being my main verb. Sometimes we add in the modal auxiliaries to help talk about how likely something is to happen or how obligated I am to do that thing. Okay, so just remember that sometimes relating verbs act as auxiliary verbs or helping verbs, so they are put with put with another verb to make a verb group to show the happening in a clause. Okay, let's put some of the work from this set of slides to what you did in the first activity, the first section. We've got functional and traditional grammar here to discuss. So in functional grammar, what's the name for the words in green? What do we call them if we're thinking about their function? Okay, of course, they're called processes, aren't they? And we would be able to say that they're actually relating processes Well, the first one is, the second one is, the third one is, the fourth one is. What about proud? What type of a process is proud? Remember, you can choose from action, saying, sensing, feeling, or relating. Prowling is an action, isn't it? Okay. Fish liked ice cream. That's going to be a sensing, feeling process. Cat screamed. There is a process that is a saying process. And is, again, back to our relating verbs. All right, so whenever you're thinking this week and you come across a verb or something that you think is acting like the happening in a clause, I want you to think about which one of the 4 categories it would fit into. Okay, let's say you're sitting listening to a teacher speaking to her class and you hear that the teacher says something like this. Today we're looking at words which tell us what is happening in the clause or about a state of being and having. Okay? Is that relating to the process or the participant? Okay. All right, see what you think, because the other option is this one. Today we're looking at words which tell us who or what is involved in the happening, being or having represented in the clause. If you're going to draw a line between the teacher's statement and the vocabulary there, where would you draw the lines? Which is the process? Which is the participant? I suspect that this is what you would have drawn if you had the chance, which is terrific. Okay, so there's been a lot of learning in this section here, and now it's time for you to go and to do some of the activities that are going to help you to understand some of the information a little bit better, and to also go on to the third folder where we'll be looking at some other really important parts of grammar that are all necessary for you as a teacher, as well as some of the things that we'll be assessing at the end of this unit of work. All right, remember to keep an eye on any parts that you need to refresh or you need to ask your tutor about when we come back to class. Good luck and enjoy learning about the exciting world of grammar.